G'day. Welcome to this part 2 of this Building Believers course, and of course this course is called Devoted. And in the first part we looked at this idea because this whole course is based on just 2 verses of Scripture. We're looking at Acts chapter 2, the very beginning of the church, and we're looking at how the church sort of, the things that the church did as it launched and the things that they were devoted to. And in Acts chapter 2 and verse 41, it talks about this great day in the church, the very beginning of the church. It says, those who accepted his message, Peter, who got up and spoke, those who accepted his message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day. That is a great day in anybody's church, where we see 3,000. I mean, if I saw 3,000 added to our number today, I'd say that's a pretty good day in anybody's book. But they were added. But the very next verse, so they believed and they baptized and they're added. And that's a great thing, because no disciple starts their journey without making a decision. A lot of people have this argument, they're just making decisions, and we actually think people can make multiple decisions, and that's part of the process. And as people go through their spiritual journey, and as they begin to go through that process, that they may make that decision many times before they really settle in and bite down on it and really understand the significance of what that decision can mean. So we encourage people and give opportunity to people every time we kind of get together and we do something that is for people in the influence zone or the reach zone. We want to make sure that we allow people opportunity to become someone who makes that decision and gets that connection with God happening. But from there, obviously, that's the beginning of something, not the end of something. And a believer's course, these believers' courses are about building believers. And of course, we want believers who want to take it to the next level and take this whole thing from where they are, from that beginning of that spiritual journey, taking it up a notch. And of course, we've been looking at how these people went from decisions to become fully devoted followers. In verse 42, the very next verse, it gives us a key to some things the early church did. It says they devoted themselves, and I love the idea of that. They devoted themselves. They didn't have somebody come and spoon feed them. They didn't have somebody have to sit with them. They devoted themselves. And firstly, it says to the apostles' teaching. And last week we looked at what that means. The apostles' teaching is basically doctrine, and essentially the easiest way to explain it is they devoted themselves to the Word of God, of the house of God that they were in, so that whoever the apostle was that was over their area, that was the teaching they devoted themselves to. They didn't argue with it, they didn't fight with it, they went with the flow of it, and they got a much better result. The word devoted here means to adhere or stick to be steadfastly attentive to persevere, or to show oneself courageous for. So the idea of being devoted is quite different from what we may think. And being devoted, not only do we need to be devoted, but we need to learn how to devote ourselves. And this is a very liberating thing. And in this day and age, there's so many ways that we can devote ourselves. So the first thing they devoted themselves to was the apostles' teaching. The second thing they devote themselves to is the local church. I'm going to look at that one today. The second thing, the local church. It says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship. Now, I'm sure you had good discussion about what it meant to be devoted to the apostles' teaching. This week we're going to look at the fellowship and what that really means. It wasn't to fellowship. Fellowship is an idea that is only really a church idea. That is, when you break that idea down, is something that is it's got some spiritual component to it and a physiological component where we're actually connecting with people physically in front of ourselves. We can't get fellowship unless we're actually in front of other people, and that's a really powerful thing. But here, really, when we break it down, the idea of the fellowship here, the local church, and they're talking about both the corporate and the individual local church. So there is the fellowship, and then there's fellowship that happens within the fellowship. And so both of those things are both connotations of this one idea here, the fellowship. So we want to be devoted to the corporate local church, which is the wider body, and then there's also the house that we're in. And I say to leaders, if we are living together and we're in the same house and we're working together towards the same goals, then obviously we're going to be much closer than if you're to leave and you go off and you meet in some other person's house and you live in their house. Obviously our relationship's going to change because we're not going to see each other anymore. Does it mean we're not friends? No, it just means that we've got different visions and going in different directions, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's part of understanding that the fellowship that we had when we were working together, it was far closer than what we will have once we're not working together. And the relationship will change, and it'll be at whatever level it is based upon the house that we're in. And I obviously would expect if a leader moves on to another house, I would want them to be really committed to the house that they're in. And I want them to do really well there. And to do that, we have to let go of them. And particularly me, as the leader who's been leading them, I have to let go of them. And so there's the corporate local church life, the fellowship, where there's that corporate gathering thing where we come together. And there's one word that describes both the individual and the corporate thing. The individual side of it is fellowship that we experience between one another. And the Bible uses just one word to describe all of this. And the one word is there because it's all intertwined. We can't have one without the other. The word fellowship is a unique word. It's a word that's unique to the church. You don't hear it spoken outside of the church, except for the occasional mystical movie title, obviously, Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring. You don't really hear or see this idea of fellowship. You don't see a group of teenagers going, let's go down to Macca's and a movie and have some fellowship. You don't see that. They don't talk that way. You don't see a bunch of workmates after work on a Friday night saying, let's go to the pub after work for some drinks and some fellowship. No, we don't do that. We don't talk about that. Why? Because it really is a church idea. It's a church term. And that's why here it talks in the early church, they devoted themselves to the fellowship, and to the fellowship, one with each other, and also to the corporate fellowship that we have together. And some people try and separate those things and say, it's the house church is what's really important. They had church in the home. Yeah, well, if you really study history and you really look at the historical context of that, there was probably about 100 people that used to meet in the courtyard of their home. And then also the writer of Hebrews, for instance, he says, do not forsake the gathering of yourselves together, as some are in the habit of doing. And that idea is actually about this idea of, it means to call out from the home and go and have a bigger, larger corporate gathering together. So even though we meet in homes and we do things in homes and we do things in smaller groups, so we have large group settings in home and smaller group settings in homes, because they would meet daily around the table, and that's a whole nother issue. Again, we'll look more at that in the next session. But in this session, understanding the fellowship is understanding that it's both of those ideas intertwined together, that we have both of those ideas, and you're intertwining, understanding we've got the fellowship, the larger corporate fellowship that we have when we come to gather together, and also the individual fellowship we get from connecting with one another. There's just something that takes place, and there's a spiritual connotation to that, and there's also a physical connotation. So we physically get with each other face to face. I don't believe we can have real fellowship that it's talking about here without getting face to face. And there's something about that face to face thing around the table that does something. And I know we can have all sorts of really effective communication, and in this day and age we communicate in all different ways, and generationally we even communicate quite differently. But I really want to encourage you to understand that we need to devote ourselves. They devoted themselves to the fellowship, so to the corporate church that we're involved with, and having fellowship there as a corporate body of believers. There's something about just getting together in a corporate setting where we have gatherings together, and we called out to gather together. And there's also something quite powerful that takes place when we get together as individuals and across a table from one another. So I want to encourage you in both of those things and understanding that both are important. And the reason that we're focusing on these, the early church, is by the time you get to Acts 6, when it comes time to take the church to a whole nother level, they're having an argument about who's being fed and what has to happen. And the apostles say, we need to take this to another level. We need to focus on the word. We need to focus on prayer and taking this whole thing to a whole nother level. And so we need leaders who can work the day-to-day stuff. Well, it was because they were practicing these 4 things that we're talking about that they had plenty of leaders to choose from, plenty of great believers who were practicing great things because they devoted themselves. And that's the whole point of this series, to understand we need to devote ourselves. Not be looking at being spoon-fed, not be looking at ways of putting pressure on other people, but learning how to devote ourselves to the things that God says we need to devote ourselves to. Well, have a great time with your facilitator now. You're going to discuss some of these ideas. You'll create conversation around some questions that we'll put to you, so that as believers we can have a great conversation about this idea of what it is to have fellowship and what fellowship really looks like, even in the ages that we live in now. So I really want to encourage you, get around, create some good conversation, have a great time, and we'll see you again next time for the next session of this Building Believers series, Devoted.